Hello there. Hi, everybody. I'm Simon Blanchard. I'm partner at the Data Protection Network Associates, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar from the Data Protection Network, sponsored by Extero, and entitled Handling Data Incidents and Breaches, Get on the Front Foot. Thanks very much for joining us today. We're delighted to have you with us for what promises to be an interesting and insightful hour. You may ask questions to the panel as we go. We have a chat button that you can use. If you can see the chat button on your screens there, just click on that and you'll be able to send a question over to us. We have actually had some of your questions in advance, because if you remember when you signed up, you could actually submit a question then. So we've got some of those already kind of built in, and we'll plan to cover those shortly. Just for your benefit, we are actually recording this session, so there'll be a link sent out to you as well. Around about this time tomorrow, you should get an email from us just saying the recording's now available. So if you'd like to watch it again or pass it on to colleagues, you can do that. So your panel are with you here on screen. We're going to do some introductions in just a moment, but just before we do that, I'd like for those of you that don't know Data Protection Network or have not been to one of our webinars before, just to do a little introduction for you about who we are. So DPN is a data protection consultancy, helping clients both large and small with data and their privacy matters. We publish a wide range of useful articles and guides and opinion pieces, alongside obviously events on our website, which is dpnetwork.org.uk. We also provide training workshops for teams, particularly obviously teams who handle personal data. These are always kind of practical and engaging sessions, and we use relevant examples wherever we can to bring that to life for people, which we find really improves the quality of the learning experience. And of course, in addition to all of that, we run events like the one today. Coming up very soon, we've got a couple more webinars I just wanted to mention, so that you're aware of those. The first one is about international data transfers, and the second one is our cookie boot camp. So if you're interested in any of those, obviously go along to the events page and sign up for those. I'd like to very much thank our today's event sponsor, which is Extero, for their kind support. And now I'm delighted to introduce you to Rebecca Perry, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Extero, who will host the event from here. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Simon. And do you mind pulling up the slides so that we can have some visual aids? I'm a visual person, and that really helps. Terrific.
There we go.
Well, thank you all. Perfect. There we go. We'll jump ahead a couple here. And Simon, are we going to make the slides also available to the attendees after the event?
Yes, absolutely. The slides are available if anyone would like them. You can, on the email that you receive, if you want to drop me a line, but normally, the video is what people will most often use. Terrific.
Thank you. Well, we're really pleased to partner with the Data Protection Network. I'd like to give you just a quick background on Extero. We are the leading provider of legal governance, risk, and compliance solutions, really designed to help legal teams, IT, and privacy teams address the overlapping areas of data privacy, e-discovery, digital forensics, and cybersecurity compliance. Our legal GRC platform is specifically built for teams to help mitigate risks and liabilities in these areas, including streamlining data breach response, which we'll be discussing today. I think one thing that I'd like to point out really quickly is that, the way that companies manage data is key to addressing so many of the concerns that are facing companies today, and particularly in the crosshairs of privacy and cybersecurity. And what we're finding is that forward-thinking organizations are implementing a new strategy for optimizing their processes and managing their data. And that's what the Extero Legal GRC platform is really focused on. All right, so we'll go ahead and dive in. I'd really like to just give you a little bit of my background, and then I'm going to ask the other panelists to introduce themselves. I'm really excited for the group that we have here today. Again, my name is Rebecca Perry. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Extero. And really for the last 27 years, I've been working closely with legal, IT, compliance, privacy professionals, along with their outside counsel, to help their organizations manage information in compliance with these legal and regulatory obligations. I've been a certified information privacy professional for the last 10 years, And I've been in the trenches with our clients, helping them, really solve these complex challenges related to GDPR and these expanding data privacy and cybersecurity regulations. And I'm thrilled that Simon invited us to participate. So Simon, did you want to kick off with a little bit of your background as well?
Yeah, I'll just do a little bit because I appreciate people have heard me speak already a little. So I'm partner at the Data Protection Network Associates. My background is that I've been in data pretty much all my career, but actually for the most part I've been a practitioner in data. So I've been kind of a marketing leader with data, helping organizations use build their data asset and create it for marketing purposes. So creating a single customer view, consulting with the people across a large business. I was actually in a publishing company, managing that for 16 years. So that's been my background. And 6 years ago, I switched over to the other side and became a data protection person because I'd had quite a lot of experience of that in my role. So I moved over to this side and now provide consulting services and have done for the last kind of 6 years or so, providing consultancy to businesses on helping them to understand, recognize, and manage their data protection. So that's a bit about me. So should we hand over to Matthew now?
Definitely, Matthew, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I started my career with the UK regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office, approximately 8 years ago. Started off by advising organisations across the board on data protection and privacy. I then moved into the audit department, leading teams auditing data protection and privacy compliance. And after approximately 3 years with the regulator, I also jumped over the same fence as Simon and started helping organisations in-house. Started off continuing my work in the public sector, the London Borough of Hounslow, dealing with large volumes of information and special categories of data. And then latterly, I've spent my career in the commercial sector, working as Balfour Beatty's first data protection officer, followed by Thomson Reuters, covering the EMEA region, and I'm now head of data privacy at Survitech Group, who provide health and safety equipment to lots of different organisations across 96 countries.
Always great to have the in-house perspective. So Matt, thank you for joining us. And Rosa, so pleased for you to join us as well.
Thank you. So my name is Rosa Barceló. I work for a law firm called Esquire Pattern Box. I'm in Brussels, in Belgium, but the law firm is a global law firm. We have offices in London, in the EU, in quite a few member states, Paris, Berlin, Frankfurt, Madrid, and we are headquartered in the US, and we have also presence in China and Japan. So myself, I am completely specialized on data protection and privacy. I co-chair the practice at the Squire Pattern Box, and I was amused because all the co-panelists have switched sides. My previous life for 13 years, I was with the European Commission in charge of data protection and privacy. And with the European Data Protection Regulator, sometime meeting with the Article 29 Working Party, and I also moved to the other side as Simon and certainly Matthew. I was thinking whether we ever met in our previous role. So that's for me. As I said, we help companies to apply data protection rules to sometimes monetize data and with data breaches, of course. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you.
Thank you all so much. Should be a fantastic conversation. I know we're going to pack a lot in today, so we'll go ahead and get started. So we've kind of broken the discussion into 3 segments. First, we're going to look at what companies need to do before a breach happens to be in the best position possible to respond. Then we'll look at, what happens when a breach or an incident occurs and all of the moving parts that need to take place and be executed flawlessly under very tight timelines. And then we'll sort of reassess after the breach, what do companies need to be thinking about, lessons learned, looking back. And so that is our agenda for the day. As Simon mentioned, if you want to submit questions, please do so during the chat. We are going to leave some time at the end of the discussion to try to answer as many of those questions. Some folks did submit questions ahead of time, and so we've got some places reserved to actually incorporate those. All right, so we're going to go ahead and dive in, and I think it's always great to start out with some interesting statistics. And Simon, can you go ahead and kick us off? I think this is a great analysis of, companies that have suffered data breaches in the last year.
Yes, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, some big numbers here actually on the slide. So this was the source of this came from a recent report that was published in CSO Online, which found that up to 88% of UK businesses have suffered some form of data breach over the last 12 months. There were similarly concerning figures actually for many European countries, as you see some on here on the screen, but indeed kind of globally as well. So 90% of security professionals in that survey said that the volume of attacks that they faced had increased over that last 12 months as well. So let's just delve in a little bit to what kind of threats we're talking about here. So first, if we look at the cyber threats, kind of first of all, for example, things like social engineering threats, the most common, probably the one that we think of would be phishing emails, which have become increasingly sophisticated and believable over time. People are more likely to, I think, to get caught out by phishing because they're so clever. So that's one of the risks. The next one I think would be the increase that we've seen in ransomware attacks, which is where your data is attacked and becomes encrypted, and you have to pay you get a demand for payment to release the data. Also, things like denial of service attacks, which obviously prevent access, prevent the data being available. Third-party vendor software. And things like the vulnerabilities that we've seen from things like cloud computing setups being exposed. There's been a number of cases where that's happened too. So so many kinds of cyber threat to protect your business against, but actually also it's also important to bear in mind the non-cyber threats as well. So the ones that are kind of caused by human error. I think I think we've got a slide just illustrating this. So 72%. So this is the kind of percentage of the personal data breaches received by the ICO in Q2 last year. So 72% of them were actually non-cyber. So I think there's a lot of publicity that we hear, a lot of things that we hear about the cyber breaches, but actually I think it's just important to draw attention to these non-cyber. And kind of things that we mean by this is things like data being emailed or posted to incorrect recipients, verbal disclosure of personal data when it's unauthorized to the wrong person, loss or theft of paperwork, data that's left in an insecure location, or things like failure to redact personal information. So all of those would be classed as non-cyber and generally part about human error. Situations whereby these breaches might potentially have been prevented by things like better training of employees, by adopting kind of maybe just some more routine security measures, and quite simply people taking better care with the personal data that they're handling, and in particular when they're sharing that data as well. It's worth also mentioning, I think, at this stage that we carried out our own research survey, knowing that we had this webinar coming up. So we thought, right, great opportunity to ask the DPN audience what their experience has been of data breaches and incidents. And we had some interesting results, I think, from that. So 70% of the responders says, yes, we have actually suffered a data breach within the last 12 months. And I think quite remarkably, 91% actually said in their situation it was caused by human error. So they cited things again relating to email sent to the wrong recipients, incorrectly spelling an email address and then ended up sending it to the wrong person, or forwarding attachments in error. Some others mentioned things like phishing or spam emails, things like that maybe they clicked on, or and sensitive postal mail also going to the wrong address was one thing that was mentioned. So yeah, quite interesting. The other finding that we had from that was just under 70% did say that yes, they do have an up-to-date incident plan. They have updated it, but 22% that it was actually something that was in progress, and 8% actually have no plan at all. So hopefully for those organizations, today's session will be helpful, talking about how we can go about and plan and prepare better. There's one more thing I just wanted to add here, is that we also asked about what were the kind of things that keep you awake at night, what actually worried you in terms of data breaches and incidents. And the key trends here were people worried about, obviously, the reputational damage that a business can suffer. They also worry about staff not reporting their mistakes quickly enough, or not, in fact, reporting them at all, which I guess can be, something that can happen. Maybe not being open about the disclosure if they suffer an incident themselves, or if they become aware of one. Not being made aware that a serious incident has occurred, so failures of communication in the business. Customer data being used for fraud was another thing that came out from that. Challenges very much, which I'm sure we'll talk about, particularly probably with Rosa, is the challenges in meeting that 72-hour timescales that we have for reporting incidents when you know about them. And obviously now the threat of legal action by individuals, by data subjects, people making kind of class action. So I think we're going to ask Rosa to comment next on kind of what your experience has been.
Yeah, Simon. So my experience coincides fully with what you have just reported, and the network of respondents commented. So most of when I look at the data breaches that come to our site, I would say that 70% are human error, and very often tend to be things that are not huge. So a few pay slips that have been mailed to the wrong person. They were crossed, and the wrong people received the wrong one. A server that was left open to people who were not supposed to have access to this data. Things like that, or a laptop that was left in a place where it was not supposed to be, but then I think that this goes alongside with something that I think is we see more and more, and there are potentially bigger impact, and this is you also mentioned ransomware. So ransomware in companies that sometimes are not necessarily what one would call a data-rich company, like that, but rather a B2B company operating some sort of industrial products that you would not expect. That we are seeing more and more, and so ransomware, and also sometimes threat actors that get into the network and to stay in the network for some time. Sometimes they are not detected, and simply to steal information. So my sense is that roughly, in my experience, is 70% human error, 30% malicious, which might go also, there might be a human error insofar as somebody click on a phishing email, but so this is the proportion.
Matt, did you want to chime in from the in-house perspective, how sort of these scenarios help you to think about, preparations and training and things like that?
Yeah, so I think the thing to say in respect of when we see these kind of incident indicators is to kind of consider how they could play out in your own organization, try and find some synergy between what's happening and identify how the risks are similar and what you can do to mitigate them. Each organization has its different challenges, its different risk areas, and it's about pinpointing what is important to your organization and what the likely impact is and what you can do to tackle it. And I think as a result of not only thinking in a theoretical sense, but when things actually do happen, learning lessons from those incidents so that the same don't happen again.
Well, I think that's a great backdrop for the discussion. And I think it really, becomes part of what you think about when you put together your incident response plan, or what are those trends that you're seeing, the types of incidents, the types of breaches that are taking place. We're going to transition now sort of into what are some of the challenges that organizations need to overcome, thinking about those types of incidents and incorporating that into the plan. So we've broken this down into 4 sort of categories, if you will, that I think helps to, break this into bite-sized pieces that you can really break down. And so first is the plan. Do you have one? Is it up to date? The second, who are the people within your organization? Thinking about those different types of scenarios, incidents, and breaches that could take place. Have you thought through who the right stakeholders are within your organization? Are they ready to respond? Have you run tabletop exercises with them? Then looking at the process. Oftentimes we see that organizations, have sort of an ad hoc process in place for executing that incident response plan, leveraging spreadsheets, email. And so documenting the overall process can be difficult. And then it comes down to the defensibility. Just because you have an incident or a breach doesn't mean that you can't come out, sort of the best outcome. And so having thought through the plan, having the right people, executing the process, and then ensuring that you're documenting that and that you can explain your decisions throughout the process are essential. And so with that, I'd like to kind of kick it off to Matt, because this is your world every day. You're living through this and thinking through, the what if scenarios. I'd love to get your thoughts on some of these challenges, how you address them within your organization.
So I think the key thing to have is, if you look at those 4 kind of cornerstones, if you like, is a real full picture focus and making sure that each one isn't understated. So you absolutely need a plan, and that should be up to date and it should be reviewed on a regular basis. But it's the people that are the real heartbeat of it, because if you have a plan, that is one cornerstone, but essentially you need the people to bring that plan to life. So you need the people who become aware of the incident to be able to report it in a timely manner. And then you need to get the right people around the table, essentially the key stakeholders in respect of the incident, depending what it entails, to agree what needs to happen in terms of managing and mitigating the incident, considering whether it's notifiable to the regulator, and then thinking as a feed forward, what are the lessons to be learned? What do we need to do in future so the same thing doesn't happen again? And I think that sort of leads on to kind of having a clear process from start to finish, but ensuring your staff are briefed on a regular basis. And I think if you can do that, then you put yourself in a strong defensible position, because you're kind of showing that you not only have a plan, but your staff are aware of it. And as a result of that, the process is clear and detailed. And I think it's not to be understated to keep, the plan needs to be detailed and thorough, but it also needs to be simple to be effective, because the people who are working on data privacy and information security day in, day out understand the technical ins and outs of what needs to happen. But in the simplest sense, what you're looking for from your staff, if they see something occur, is to pick up the phone and notify the people who need to know in a timely manner. And that is why it's key to not overcomplicate it.
And Rosa, I think it would be great to hear your perspective, because, as Simon mentioned, 72 hours is a very short time period. I think language matters in how you define an incident before you say it's a breach, to have that time to investigate it. So what are your thoughts, blind spots, things that folks in the audience might benefit from hearing from your perspective?
Well, to start, I want to say that I completely agree with what Matt and you yourself, Rebecca, said about emphasize the need for preparation. I guess that I never get tired to emphasize how important it is to have a plan and not to have it in the drawer, because sometimes we produce plans for companies and you feel that it's like ticking the box. They have it, they put it in a drawer, and that's it. I think that having the plan and rehearsing, trainings, that is very, very important, the training. And when the breach occurs, I think you see the difference of the companies who are well prepared. Something that I have found very important is a good flow of information between the IT people, the company that is helping to ascertain whether there is a breach on a technical means, and flowing down to lawyers. At the end of the day, since I am on the lawyer side, I normally notify the authorities. I am the interlocutor with the data protection authorities, and I need information in order to properly notify and avoid sanctions. So having a good flow of information, I find that is key. But perhaps just to add an extra point on what I find that I have thought that is quite important and is related in the preparation before the breach occurs, is knowing whether you can benefit of the so-called lead authority. And so let me just explain a little bit the background to make sure that I make the point correctly. So if you are a company that have various establishments in the European Union, and the breach occurs that affects data of, let's say, 5 establishments, then when a breach happens, you have to decide whether you have to go to these 5 authorities where each establishment is located, and within this period of 72 hours, notify to the regulators. So in this context, it comes extremely handy to be able to say, well, I have one lead authority, and this is the one that I am going to go, and I will have one interlocutor and not 5. And because it could be 27 if you had 27 entities, which for large companies sometimes happens. So having the ability to rely on the lead authority means that you have to, before, you have to make sure that you have made the right assessment. And it all boils down, when you have various entities, you have to be able to say whether there is one that is the main establishment. So do you have a main establishment within these 5, 7, or 22 or 27? And whether you have a main establishment or not, there are some factors that will be decisive. For example, if you have a central administration, if the data protection purposes and means are decided in one of the establishment. For example, if you have a human resources department with a director that make decision in a given place, could you argue that this is the main establishment? So all of that is something that companies sometimes do in advance, not thinking necessarily about the breach thing in general. But when a breach comes, you have made this assessment, it comes extremely handy, because then you can go to this one authority only. So this is one of the preparatory documents that we would always advise a company to have ready in cases of a breaches, but in other areas too, in complaints from citizens in general. So that was my the extra point. The others, I completely agree with what you and Matt mentioned.
Thank you. Simon, would love to get your thoughts here as well. I know that there's a lot that we could cover, but maybe some highlights that you could share.
Sure, yeah, because quite a lot, you've covered quite a bit already there, which is great. And hearing Rosa talking about there, the challenges around how to report when you've got so many different jurisdictions and things. But so I'd probably look from when I've worked with clients more in the really initial triage stage. And that's where I find that with a lot of clients, that can be the real challenge, is how you plan. And Matt talked about the importance of the plan and the people, but it's those first 24 hours and what happens at that stage. And I think I'd quite like to just highlight that part and in terms of the planning. So thinking about things like your incident reporting process. So what does your reporting process look like? And for many organizations, it's an email, say, to IT help desk or to someone in compliance, but just getting the word out so that everybody knows, the importance of reporting, and B, where do they report that to? And then secondly, for those that are receiving it, again, a challenge that I've seen quite often for organizations, if it's the IT help desk, which is quite a common way for people to raise incidents like this, are the staff on the IT help desk, and I'm speaking probably to be fair for larger businesses here, but I think this applies to smaller, do they know how to spot a data incident? Will they recognize that what this person is reporting actually sounds like it could be a data breach? It's a serious incident, and therefore, can they ask the right questions? And have you got the right opportunity to capture the information at that stage? And then to be able to escalate it, because the key thing there, it needs to be escalated quickly so that the right people come involved. And the next bit around that is being really clear who's your incident lead. So if you do have something that looks like a data breach, data incident, making sure that that first responder team and the leader are informed, including covering things like holidays, because clearly, from my experience, data breaches, things like that, can often happen on a Friday afternoon, or that's when you hear about it. And there aren't the right people around, or so-and-so's on holiday this week. Just being clear what happens in those scenarios so you've got the right resources to be able to tackle it quickly, because if you do get a breach, you will want to handle it quickly. And then just building on that is what's your plan? That I think the key part of the plan for me is how you establish the key facts rapidly. And the key one, I think, being what you do in that first 24 hours to be able to assess the breach and identify particularly, is there any personal data involved in it? So I just thought it'd be worth sharing just a few thoughts around that first 24 hours and what I see as the pinch points around that area. Clearly there's more as we go on, but a few of the pinch points I think there.
That's terrific. And I think our conversation has stirred up some questions. We have a couple here that were submitted ahead of time that I'd like to address. The first, do data processors have legal obligations to report possible or suspected data breaches or risk of a breach to controllers? And so, Rosa, this is, I think, a complex question. I'd love to get your thoughts initially on this one.
Okay, so the GDPR clearly says that the data processor must report to the data controller a breach when the data processor is aware of the breach. So the breach must be real one. He must know that a breach has occurred. It doesn't need to report a potential breach when he's not certain, a suspected breach. Now, that's the law. What is happening, that's in the reality. What is happening is that the data controller and the processor, they always have an agreement in place, a data processor agreement, which is required under Article 28. In this data processor agreement, by contract, very often the controller will require the processor to report a suspected breach. So it goes beyond the law and requires the processors to report a suspected breach. So why does the processor, the controller, want to be reported? Well, a controller might want to have already noticed that maybe there is a breach in order to get prepared for the notification, for potential remediation, for the data subjects, for the press. At the same time, the processor, depending on who you represent, when you draft the agreements, you would suggest, well, do you want already notification of a suspicion? So the processor usually will say, no way, we don't want to notify a suspicion of a breach because we will be notifying all the time. And very often the processor will auto say, why should we bother the controller with a suspicion? They get all excited and at the end, there is nothing. But you also realize that on the controller side, well, it's your data. You are the controller. You might want to know it, there is something going on. So again, by law, no, only when you are aware of the breach, but you need to check the contract, what you sign, depending on you are a processor or a controller. Is a good question. It's interesting.
Definitely. And I know that there's been a couple of questions I've been monitoring in the chat here. And one is awareness, right? I think we actually have this question later, but it's come up a couple times now. So I think it's worth addressing at this point. When does that 72-hour clock start? And how do you define aware? Because you can have an incident that may not involve personal data, but at that point when you're aware. Can you define that real briefly, Rosa?
Well, when you look at the legislation, it doesn't give you guidance. Now, the European regulators issued guidance in 2016, was still the Working Party 29, not the board, but this opinion has been endorsed by the board. Basically, they say when you have, and you will tell me it says nothing, but I think it is. It says when you have a reasonable degree of certainty, that a breach has occurred that entails personal data being compromised. So bottom line, legally the standard is reasonable degree of certainty. And then they give examples and they tell you, well, somebody reported that there is a breach in your company, an employee. You are not aware at that time. You need to do an investigation, and only when you are certain, then you will have awareness. So it's not the moment where somebody told you, it's the moment where you have done your due diligence. And in my opinion and my experience is that with clients, we might spend some days looking, is this a breach or not? And all that time, we consider that the clock has not started until we are certain that yes, is a breach, and we deem ourselves having awareness. I'm sorry, I cannot be more precise. It's not extremely 2 + 2 = 4, but I think this opinion gives some margin of maneuver and to think that is not immediately when somebody tells you you have a breach. No, you have to investigate.
Definitely. And I think that's such an important point. And I think it goes back to the people, right? As Matt, as you said, having the right people involved, having that flow of communication, and the documentation so that when you've made that determination as a company, along with outside counsel, that's when that clock starts. Matt, anything that you would add from the in-house point of view?
I think, drawing back to what you were referencing about what I was saying earlier about the right people being at the table. I mean, I think from what sort of Rose has talked about and alluded to, it's long been debated, I think, since GDPR has come into force, along with other associated privacy legislation, that I think it's not always clear cut in terms of awareness, in terms of when that threshold is hit, when the risk is likely to have an impact on the rights and freedoms of individuals, so when it's required to be notified. And I think that's really why you need to either be looking internally to your sort of data protection officer or team, or externally if you're using external counsel. And I think really that's kind of the bottom line of their job description, to make that judgment call on your behalf. And, it's not voting the legislation, but that is what they are there to do. Essentially, they are there to provide you the steer and direction. Appreciate, obviously, for smaller businesses and entities, they might not necessarily have that level of skill set, but I think equally, I think the regulators will take that into account in terms of the level of expectation. And I think the bottom line of it all is showing that you've done the right thing. And it is a difficult balancing act, because right when the legislation comes out, there was a lot of over-reporting, as it was seen, in terms of when breaches had occurred. But equally, I think, if in doubt, you don't want to be seen to be covering something up. It's important to be transparent. So it's essentially, down to the data protection team, down to the organisation. But I think if organisations are unsure, it's better to be upfront about what has happened and what you're doing to mitigate the incident, rather than sweep it under the carpet. Because I think, we have seen incidences where that has happened, and it can sometimes be used as an aggravating factor for enforcement action.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I know we're just kind of getting into our slide deck. We still have a lot of content to cover. Rosa, on this question regarding Brexit, can you give a high-level brief response, and then perhaps maybe that's something we can follow up on towards the end if there's some more detail we need to provide.
Yeah, let me try to be very fast. So to answer this question, this company that suffer a breach, the first thing that we need to know is whether this company is a company that is covered by the GDPR. So if it has no entities in the continent, does this company sell to the company, to Europe in general, to the EU? Does it target the EU? If we determine that yes, there is a targeting of the EU because it's trying to sell, let's say, to France, it has a French website, it charges in euros, and there is a breach, and this breach affects, let's imagine, French citizens and UK citizens and then German citizens. In this case, yes, it will have an obligation to notify because it's covered by the GDPR, and it's covered by the GDPR because it's targeting Europeans. So you see, it's very factually based. Now, if we go back, the same company, it had some European customers, but there is no targeting of European customers. Is a UK company that is not trying to sell outside the UK, only in the UK. In this case, the company is not covered by the GDPR. It doesn't need to appoint a representative. And if there is a breach, there is no need to notify the European regulators. So the bottom line is that to answer the question, we must first know whether the company is covered by EU GDPR, in addition then to the UK GDPR. And this is what will determine whether, yes, is covered, we need to notify European regulators outside the UK. Is not covered, then only ICO. Sorry.
No, thank you so much. It's such an interesting question, and I'm sure we'll continue to evolve here. All right, well, let's move into our next segment here, which is You've Been Breached. And looking at all of those moving parts with the plan and the people, how you report that, all of that matters. And hopefully you've done a good job at addressing those challenges up front. But we'd like to discuss just some key things that happen when this lands on, the data protection officer's desk, and what does that look like? So I'm actually, just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and jump forward. I think we've talked a little bit around these things. But again, I'm a visual person. I like to kind of put this into a plan. What does that look like? And so, Matt, why don't we get your perspective? So, something has happened, the incident has landed on your desk. How do you think about this process and really operationalizing it?
I mean, that is heavily dictated by what your organisation's incident process is. But I think the key thing for me, no pun intended, is information, and as much of it as possible. So you want to understand exactly what has occurred, when did it occur, how did it occur, who was affected by it. What is currently happening now? Is there a continued risk to the data? Or is that stagnant? Has it been mitigated? Mm-hmm. And I think once you have all the information around the breach, it's then assessing what you need to do to mitigate it, whether it's notifiable, and then from there, taking the steps to operationalize it. And I think that's at a very high level. I guess digging down into the detail, I guess it would depend heavily. Is there a technical aspect to it, or is it human error that may be able to be more easily mitigated or tackled? Is the breach down to human error, or is there a more malicious angle to it that your systems have been hacked or impregnated for whatever reason. So I think they're the key things, and then as a step forward, as I mentioned earlier, involving the appropriate people to mitigate it. And then once you've hopefully done that, and that could last over a period of time, depending how technical or how complex the breach is, how many people have been involved, what are the levels of data, has the data been recovered, etc. So I think there's quite a lot of variables to it, but it's about having a clear plan and framework, and then as an add-on, as I mentioned earlier, learning from the lessons of that breach and putting measures in place to ensure, hopefully, that the same situation doesn't happen again. And probably if it does, asking yourself, why did it happen? Is there anything more that could have been done?
And I think, we talked a lot about early on the types of incidents, things that organizations really need to be thinking about. And so, kind of over here on the right are some standards to think about, right? So thinking ahead on what those scenarios are. If that scenario happens, how do you operationalize that and put that into play, collect the evidence necessary? One thing I'd like to point out, and Matt, you sort of highlighted this, is that the people are such an important part of this, and having a way to track when employees move or change within the organization is key. Who is their backup if they are, on holiday, and having, some standard notification and communications available at your disposal can help to execute this process. Having a way to securely communicate internally within the organization and those stakeholders, as well as outside counsel, I think is all key, and it's all part of that, documentation of that process. Simon, what are your thoughts? You've had a lot of experience with this in operationalizing, breaches. What would you add to the discussion?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, if you can hear me okay there, I think you've covered quite a lot there. Matt covered kind of all of the different steps, really, or a lot of the steps, really, at a high level. I think that gives a nice summary, and I think you've summarised the importance of the other areas as well there, Rebecca. So I don't really feel the need to add too much more, if I'm honest, without, conscious of time as well, that we've got just 10 minutes or so left. I'd just be going into details and things. So I think just the one thing I'd add in, that I think has been mentioned, is just that internal comms bit, but from the point of view of escalating it up to those other people that need to be aware. So I'm thinking, if it is a breach, you need to be informing whoever handles your media, and making sure that you handle the media communications, because you will get journos contacting you. You will get those situations. So thinking about the reputational risk involved and how you're going to handle that part will be the only other bit that I'd probably add into what's already been mentioned there.
Very good. All right. Well, let's move on. I know we have some more questions. I think we've answered maybe a couple of these here. I know we've touched on the awareness. I did see that we had another question in the chat panel regarding severity or grading system. And I think, our audience has been very responsive and helpful. And I think they actually shared a link to a risk calculator. So if you access the chat, you'll see that. I'm not familiar with this, but it seems to be well received, and other folks have commented on that as well. So maybe we could go to this third question, which is, what sorts of enforcement actions are we seeing, if any, come out of breaches? And so Rosa, we had an interesting conversation around this question. And I'd love for you to just kind of share your thoughts on what your experience has been with clients.
Mm-hmm. Well, my experience is that not because there is a breach, there is always a sanction. So very often a breach might lead to the authorities to close the case. Maybe the authorities felt that the company had put in place safeguards. Unfortunately, the safeguards were, sometimes you see that the authorities will ask, show us what security measures you have, which organizational measures, and despite your training employees that you have the proper against phishing attacks, and yet despite everything you suffered a breach because there was a ransomware. Well, I have found that very often the authority would not necessarily fine the companies. So in some cases there might be, but in my experience, just my comment is that there are quite a few cases that no, there has not been sanctions.
Simon, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There are a number of cases, obviously, that don't lead to any specific sanctions or enforcement like that. But I think it's important just to remember that the data breaches do come in all sorts of shapes and sizes with different levels of kind of volumes and severity and kind of likelihood that they would actually impact on the individual as well. So from that point of view, the kind of fines that fines and actions that might take place as a result can be all sorts of different scales. In fact, I think quite recently there was enforcement action of an organisation that was a relatively small amount, but equally, if we think of the British Airways and the Marriott fines, we're talking into the high numbers of millions. So they can be I'm not sure whether an average fine is really so much it. They're all shapes and sizes, I think, is the key thing. And again, they vary across different regulators across Europe. You might find some that tend to have bigger fines. I'm sure you'll agree with this, Rosa. Some may tend to have bigger fines and some may be smaller ones. So it's not necessarily always a level playing field there, I think. For
sure. And Matt, I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of weigh in if there is sort of a matrix that you leverage to analyze the severity of data breaches that might be just in addition to kind of what the audience has shared in the chat panel.
I mean, I don't use any kind of super sophisticated system. I just use, the language which is called out in sort of the legislation, really, in terms of if it's likely to have an impact on individuals, then you need to consider notifying to the regulator, and if there's a high impact, you need to consider looking at notifying the individuals involved. And how do we sort of do and assess that? I'll look at the types of data, the amount of individuals involved, who the data has been disclosed to, and essentially trying to put myself in their shoes, really, and thinking about, I think it's a balancing act, certainly where notifying individuals are concerned, because if you've managed to tackle and appropriately mitigate the incident to a point where you're satisfied there is no risk to the data, sometimes it can do more harm than good to actually notify them, because you could cause them to become distressed unnecessarily. Drawing back to the regulators, I said earlier, if you're in doubt, you need to be transparent about what has occurred to risk breaching that requirement of the legislation. But I think equally, you have to have confidence in your ability and your organisation to mitigate the incident. And I think it's important to differentiate between, Simon talked about the incidents with Marriott, with British Airways. There is sort of a GDPR enforcement tracker out there where you can see the different types of incidents and issues as where there has been enforcement action taken, and where that I can put that link in the tracker and in the chat. And I think that's really good steer to see what are kind of the aggravating factors for enforcement, and seeing firstly before an incident occurs what you can actually put in place now to mitigate those kind of risks, as we've talked about through the presentation, and then also using it as a steer, as to consider whether you may be at risk and what you need to do to mitigate.
Thank you. And I think we just shared that link in the chat. So that's a great resource, Matt. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So I think that's a good segue to sort of this last segment, and that is post-breach lessons learned. How well, were you able to execute that incident response plan? How was the communication? Depending on the type of incident, reevaluating training for employees, looking at those policies and the checklists. Matt, I'm going to stick with you again because, this is really your world. You're probably constantly thinking about, what do we need to add? What do we need to augment? What are some highlights that you would share kind of with the audience from a post-breach lessons learned perspective? You might be on mute.
Sorry, I do apologise. I thought I took myself off mute, but I actually put myself on. Left it right until the end of the webinar to make my first error. But I think it's quite a good evidence, if you like, that we are human, which was the point I was going to make, that organisations, individuals, they do make mistakes. Breaches definitely occur. You can't cover all the bases, and I think what the regulators are looking for, what individuals are looking for, organisations do take the handling of personal information seriously, that they are diligent with their processes, that they are clear, they are transparent. So I think the thing to think about is that you will never stop breaches occurring, but what you want is transparency, both internally and externally. Externally, to hold your hands up when you have got things wrong and show individuals what you've done, and the regulators to explain what you've done to correct the issue. And I think also internally, you want your staff to feel part of a culture where they will be commended for reporting a breach, rather than thinking it's a more palatable alternative to brush it under the carpet. Because I've always encouraged and advocate staff to do that, because if they don't report the breaches, then you sort of pay your money, you take your chance. You may never come back to bite you, but it could. And I think if you can encourage that and a constructive ethos, that when staff do report and flag things all timely and promptly, that puts the data protection team and the legal team in the best possible position to mitigate and tackle the issues quickly and promptly.
Simon, anything that you would add?
I think that's a really good point that Matt's just raised there. Getting people to make sure that they will, come forward when there's a breach. But in addition, then I think this just sums up that at the end of each process, when you've had a breach, or in fact you may have had an incident that didn't turn into a breach, it's just important to take this time out to have a look back over it and say, what did we learn? And to understand whether there's always something you can learn, or something you maybe could have done better, which might be policies, procedures, but it might actually be the kind of face-to-face training and things like that. And we often find that the training of individual teams, for example, the teams that actually process your data and helping them, with their processes and how they manage data, that will often identify, could lead to a data breach. So things like that can most certainly can help. And the only thing I wanted to also add is just how it's not, data breaches is not an area on its own. There are other things that kind of think about, that kind of play into that area. So just one thing I wanted to mention that we talked about on previous webinars that we've done is the area around data retention. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly something that you think about on a data breach. If an organization is holding data for too long and you end up having a data breach, and you breach data that you should no longer have in the organization, that you should have deleted a long time ago, clearly that data breach is going to be much more severe. Equally, if you find out that that there were too many people having access to the data and the breach occurred because, in the investigation you found out too many people had access to it, there's lots of lessons that you can learn. So maybe not thinking of it in isolation, but how else it can improve our overall governance of the data and our overall kind of compliance for that matter.
Simon, I'm so glad that you mentioned the over-retention component, because I think, if you do look at some of the sanctions and fines, it was for that specific scenario that will be viewed as negligent. And that is an area that companies really need to think about as part of their data inventories, record of processing activities. Do you have retention accounted for And are you able to act on that? That is such a gap that we see with organizations that we can help fill. So I know we're coming up on time here. I'm going to go ahead and I think we've covered the questions, and I really want to thank the audience. They've been really responsive and also helping to answer those questions. So a lot of good resources through the chat. I'd like to thank Data Protection Network for inviting Extero to present. Rosa, thank you so much for your time, and Matthew. Simon, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you to wrap up with any housekeeping items.
Okay, great. Well, as you said, Rebecca, thanks everybody. Thanks to our panel. Thanks to everybody else that stayed with us. I've seen almost everyone that started has actually stayed with us, so that's fantastic to see. So thank you for your attention. We hope you found this really useful and informative today. Finally, just a quick reminder that we've got the other 2 webinars coming up as well, one on international data transfers and the Cookie Bootcamp. So if that's of any interest to anyone, please go and sign up for those. Yep, they're on the events page. And just to say, yep, I hope you've enjoyed it, and see you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.